You're watching Deprogrammed. This is the new Culture Forum show committed to fighting back against the forces of ideological conformity, particularly among the young. My name's Harrison Pitt. I'm a senior editor at the European Conservative, and Evan, being on the other side of the Atlantic, I'm thrilled to be joined this week by Connor Tomlinson, my co-presenter and the host of Tomlinson Talks at lotuseaters.com, and our special guest this week, Robert Bates, the man behind the Centre for Migration Control. Now, Rob, we've recently seen Rishi Sunak water down plans to cut student visas, particularly under pressure. If I'm not mistaken, the report seems to suggest that the main people within Cabinet putting pressure on him to do that were James Cleverly, Lord Cameron, or Lord Slippery of Tripoli, as Peter Hitchens likes to call him, and Jeremy Hunt. Obviously a disgrace, but would these plans have made much difference in the first place, even if they had been implemented? And what are the consequences of their having been watered down in the last few days?
So the plans were ultimately one of 4 strands of a package released last December that was, pretty meek from our people on our side of the ledger. It was a basic attempt to reduce 700,000 net migration to about 400,000. I think what we're seeing here is the start of even that unravelling. It's interesting, as you say, James Cleverly was behind this pushback against his attempts to reduce the graduate visa loophole, essentially. Normally you see Home Secretaries being the only person in the room banging the drum for reduced migration. I think that just shows how far the Conservative Party have actually slipped, that we've now got James Cleverly, the man with the hospitality degree and a snazzy Twitter feed, essentially calling the shots on our borders. So I think the next couple of days, obviously we're filming this just before the net migration figures come out. I think the fact that the Conservatives have already got themselves into a mess over their own plans, which were semi-skimmed milk at best anyway, shows that they're going into the general election and they don't have a clue how to bring the numbers down.
Is it purely chronic economic short-termism which is motivating this pushback within Cabinet? Is there a good faith explanation of it in those terms, even though we would regard that as wrong? Or do you think that something more sinister might be at work?
Well, it's economics, but it's not economics that they've kind of studied themselves. There's such a tendency now in government, and there has been since probably the Blair years, to outsource most mechanisms of governance to consultancies and quangos and think tanks and things like that. So I suspect what has happened is that the university sector, which is an incredibly powerful lobby group, has really targeted those that they thought were most susceptible to their line of inquiry. I think the universities, the student visas, the graduate route, this is a problem that is often overlooked by the kind of the bigger problems with the skilled visas and the health and care worker visas. But actually what you find is that this is essentially a red carpet that we have laid out since 2020, through which hundreds of thousands of people are able to stay in the country every year, long after they've completed their studies in really low-grade university courses.
Another person that I think it was the Times reporting said was agitating for this around the Cabinet table was Gillian Keegan as the Education Secretary.
Yes.
And she seems intent on not rocking the boat on the education system being a for-profit enterprise. And in terms of economic short-termism, I mean, if you flood a town with a very transitory population, you price the native population out of being able to afford the higher-end student accommodation, and then you don't think that there's going to be any cultural impact in which a large amount of Chinese students in Oxford pay patronage to which businesses, for example, then you start seeing the high street close down. There's no consideration of long-term footfall in that area, for example. It's just this one myopic, we need to flood the university sector with money, but none of the externalities are considered.
Absolutely, and if you look at where a lot of these universities are, they're in areas that aren't perhaps glistening with job prospects for these people afterwards. So what happens is you'll have a university centre in, say, Wolverhampton. You'll have 10,000 foreign students there. That will obviously have an impact on the housing market. It will have an impact on sort of short-term, part-time jobs, things like that, because obviously most people studying at the University of Wolverhampton, a lot of people studying at the University of Wolverhampton are there purely because they can see it as an opportunity to get their foot on the job market, start earning a bit of income, send it back as remittances. But then at the end of their studies, they're allowed to stay. They've got they're less tethered to the university, so they're able to kind of shift around the UK a lot more. And then obviously they go to the burgeoning metropolises. So you've had a town kind of weaned onto these foreign students that they're not even able to retain. So there's no long-termism through which they can actually plan and make any kind of progress economically.
Do you think that there's far too myopic a focus on the part of people in the Conservative Party on the handful of migrants who come here as students and perhaps study in incredibly important vocational they study STEM degrees, which then put them in a position to be real high flyers in Britain. You know, it's funny. I was watching a debate the other day it was hosted by the Free Press, Barry Weiss's Free Press in the United States, and Ann Coulter, who's always great fun, had an excellent line in which she said, you know, you guys, you promise us that we're going to get, you know, the Elon Musks of this world, we're just going to take the cream from the rest of the world, and it's going to be a boon to the United States that we have all of this high-skilled immigration. What do we get? 20 million leaf blowers, she said. Does that translate into the British context?
Oh, absolutely it does. We've got a report coming out in the next couple of weeks. We've essentially found that the worst 20 universities in the UK have about a fifth of all of the foreign students. Now, obviously, the line it's not, oh, well, these are people that are going to be the next neurosurgeons or the next doctors. It's essentially, well, we need these people's tuition fees so that British students can then go and study gender studies. So it's essentially become a huge Ponzi scheme where we're essentially told that Blair's target of 50% of people going to universities is only attainable if we then, on the other hand, import 600,000, I think is the target, 600,000 foreign students in the UK at any one time. Well, actually, I say that was the target. They've massively exceeded that. We're running at about 800,000 last academic year.
Didn't the May government set an arbitrary target, and we had to achieve it by, it might have even been 2060 or something like that, and then they achieved it within a couple of years?
Yeah,
because
they just lowered the drawbridge, and whoosh, the numbers went sky high. And anyone who says, you know, well, maybe we need, and you do hear some Tories that are, you know, quite good on pushing back against this kind of stuff. I think Suella Braverman, when she was around the table, probably said, you know, this isn't what we think it is. This isn't the boon that we think it is. But then obviously you've got Gillian Keegan, who's probably one of the softest, wettest Tory ministers at the helm in there, and hugely proud, she says, hugely proud to have exceeded the 600,000 target. And it's not a cap either. It's simply, well, we've reached that. Let's see where we can go next. So at the moment, there doesn't seem to be an end as to how they actually stop this exponential rise.
Do you think people on our side of the aisle are perhaps slightly guilty of, our side of the aisle being the you know, pretty diehard restrictionist side of the aisle, a little bit guilty of raging against the symptoms in terms of these numbers each year, but not tackling the structural problems in our economy, which make that a temptation on the part of venal elites and politicians and chronic short-termists? Should we be looking much more structurally, for example, at the universities system? To what extent does our university system predispose us towards needing, quote unquote, in the same way that the drug addict needs his happy powder, needing mass immigration as a way of...
Well, I always think, do we really need the university sector to be running at 200 odd universities? And we're told that foreign students bring 40 billion to that sector, but it's, you know, what are they actually spending that money on? I mean, you're seeing time and time again now these research projects that are being explored, ESG, EDI, kind of colonisation, you know, how we can transform McDonald's into something that perhaps, I don't know, you know, all this kind of nonsense. Go and check
more
out.
Eco-friendly, yeah.
Precisely. Charlotte Gill is doing a lot of good work digging into UKRI funding projects and that kind of stuff. But the university sector just isn't serious at the moment. It doesn't have a kind of clear relation. Obviously, there are a few exceptions, as you say, the Cambridges, the Oxfords, the kind of a few of the London ones, and
plenty of bogus stuff going on at those places.
Yeah, even
well.
then, it's a lot of the foreign students are the ones agitating to get rid of the Colston statue and things like that. Like they show absolutely no gratitude for the place in which they're in, and of course racial agitation. It's like, even if it were an economic boon, I don't think you're imparting something of worth onto the cultural texture of the country.
Even if you boil down and you don't look at it nationwide and you just look at the kind of culture that does emerge on the university campuses, it's completely different to what it would have been 40, 50 years ago. It would have been a kind of intrinsically English culture. There would have been a kind of recognition, you know, similar schooling systems, similar backgrounds, more commonality through which to engage in the exploration of ideas. Instead, now you do almost have a case where the language standards of some of the foreign students just aren't up to scratch, and it does have a huge impact on the educational experience for Brits as well. And I guess, just to go off on a bit of a tangent, I mean, COVID was obviously a absolute farce by the end of it, and the universities were massively pushing all university students, locking them away in their rooms and saying, attend these lectures over Skype, Zoom, Skype, showing my age there. But the fact is, well, if you've put those processes in place and you still need the university students, if you really, really must have this recruitment, why aren't they offering more online courses?
Yes.
And I just think that there's not enough kind of actual business acumen being deployed. And I think if you set in place strong, stringent targets, say to the university sector, you're not getting away with this anymore, find another way around because we're not handing out visas.
But this is the point, the incentive structure at these universities is clearly completely misaligned, and so you say, well, they're not showing any business acumen. They won't be rewarded for showing business acumen as much as they will be for, let's shovel in another 100,000 or so over the next, many years. I think Connor's absolutely right as well, that it's not just a question of, is this economically sensible. I think it's very much the case, and Matt Goodwin put it well in a debate that Connor and I, and you both all attended recently in the Emmanuel Centre on is immigration good for Britain or something like that. And Matt Goodwin, speaking precisely to this point, but also talking about the social care sector, was saying that, well, no, not really, because we need immigration, as I just said, like a drug addict needs his happy powder. All it shows is that we've developed a crippling dependency on immigrants. It doesn't show that it's actually good for us. So that's all true as well. Mass immigration clearly is a way of plugging otherwise pretty rotten business models, whether it's the social care sector or universities. But one thing that was very apparent to me, there was a debate, is the way in which the existence of a huge number of foreign students on campus. You would expect, given that we're accepting students from all over the world, there's going to be a proliferation of perspectives. We're going to get into debates here, but in fact, it has a real chilling effect on free speech, because it means that whichever minority group is most strident in saying we don't want to be offended, and is most willing to use the racism charge as a way of silencing all criticism of, say, what the Chinese are doing in Xinjiang or whatever it might be, it just completely distorts intellectual debate. And this came across to me most apparently when I was at a Cambridge Union debate, and Rafe Heidelmann-Koo, the NCF guy, my colleague, a senior fellow here at the New Culture Forum, was arguing that reparations should not be paid by Britain for slavery and colonialism. And the amount of foreign students in the audience who clearly were from parts of the world which had post-imperial grudges, it massively prejudiced them against Rafe's case, and it meant that they were just shouting over him. I think that the way in which this completely militates against the interests of the host population as well, and it completely rides roughshod over so many of our values, is also something that should be considered. But clearly, if the government are not considering the economic stuff, they're certainly not considering this, are they? No,
well, that's the case. We've got to win the economic argument before we can even begin to have the cultural argument countenanced. I think universities UK have just been so successful since the Blair era in making this case. And you are right. I think universities, in a way, are almost a microcosm of the kind of society that we can expect if mass migration does continue and society ultimately becomes factionalised. I think I couldn't comprehend a kind of situation where having a huge international student population would in any way not lead to people finding themselves allocated via national or more cultural lines. That's the tendency of people, isn't it? That is ultimately what will happen if you have enough people around you that you can identify with. You will coalesce around one another. So I think we should look to universities with a lot of apprehension and trepidation and think this is probably a taste of what will come writ large.
Yeah. On the economic argument, there were two reports this year which really stuck out in my mind. One that is actively agitating for mass migration to continue to 2100. No surprise it comes from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that says almost every country in the world, bar 5 nations in Africa and 1 in Asia, will have sub-replacement birth rates by that year, and therefore, in order to pay for the pension system and grow the labour market, we must import people from those countries to everywhere else. And then in the inverse of that, you recently had Neil O'Brien and former Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick's report that put to bed the question time style argument, who will serve my coffees in Pret, saying that 89% of the housing market demand that isn't being met is driven by immigration. Very few of these students at universities that are coming over, particularly from countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh, are staying on, and they end up doing like a BA honours in Uber driving by the time that they've finished. So are you encouraged in the way which the policy sector is trending, and which one do you think ministers are more likely to listen to?
They won't listen to the Neil O'Briens of the world. Unfortunately, I think that's the tendency of kind of centre-right thinking for a long time, in that it's kind of been shunned out because ultimately ministers and decision makers don't need to listen to the think tanks. They've got their own inbuilt think tanks in the civil service and the Quangos, and as we know, the likes of the Migration Advisory Committee and the OBR are chewing off ministers' ears every time they go anywhere near a decision that is perhaps remotely conservative. And I don't think there's anywhere near enough scrutiny, to be perfectly honest, on our side of the argument about the pressure that these organisations are exerting. I think the OBR has come under a bit of criticism recently, but more from the economic side of the ledger and
the economic orthodoxy rather than
the kind of the migration orthodoxy, and then even more perniciously is the Migration Advisory Committee that has arguably set off the the graduate visa route fiasco that we're seeing at the moment was arguably set off by the fact that the Migration Advisory Committee issued its kind of warning that the government shouldn't want to clamp down on this.
This doesn't necessarily always let ministers off the hook, though. I mean, Thatcher, not to what's the best way of putting it? Not to de-emphasise the importance of Quangos and these institutions, and particularly in the post-Blair era. But I think it was Thatcher who famously said, advisors advise and ministers decide. And I was not at all impressed by Boris Johnson, I think about 9 months or so ago, writing an article in the Mail on Sunday about how I'm going to get tough on immigration. And then when many people pointed out, and you can perhaps help us out on the details here, the way in which Johnson massively relaxed the rules, particularly around student visas and student dependence, which has only just been taken away by Sunak, but it was implemented, I think, in 2020. Johnson was saying, well, no, you've got to understand the Migration Advisory Committee told me that I had to do this, and it's just like, you're Prime Minister, you're not obliged to follow what they say.
That's because we don't have obviously ministers decide, but what happens if the minister doesn't have the conviction, or the minister is ultimately hearing something that they can then, that they agree with, and then ultimately able to appeal to a higher authority. So we've got this kind of veneration of pygmy institutions that emerged under Tony Blair.
But I completely agree, but there's a risk in attributing too much to the blob, which exists, that you let ministers off the hook, and so many Conservatives were trying to rehabilitate otherwise slightly unpromising, inauspicious careers are just blaming the blobocracy. I don't think that can always. I don't think that's always a good get out, particularly if you're empowering the blob by beefing up DEI laws and other things.
There was a minister on the Home Affairs Select Committee this week who was grilling someone about care dependent visas, and he genuinely didn't understand that before 2021 there was not a care worker visa. So why are you sitting on the Home Affairs Select Committee?
Yes.
Why are you making decisions on that if you're just woefully uninformed?
That's where we're at. He's probably very good at putting up 280 characters on Twitter. I imagine he's incredibly charming at players or somewhere like that. But they're just we just don't have a decent calibre of a politician is ultimately where we are at. And that's almost in the same way that perhaps you have a kind of work-shy dependency nurtured by a benefit system, and that is perhaps too generous. You've almost got politicians these days that are benefiting from an advice system that's far too generous. You are right, it does stop with them, and ultimately I think they deserve the criticism for having outsourced it in the first place and not gripping the mantle. And I think there's all too much kind of self-promotion in the idea that for those few that do recognise the problem, that they can just go in and sledgehammer rather than, unfortunately, playing the game a little bit more. I think you've got to be nouseful, if that's a word, tactical.
Noetic is the adjective for nous.
Noetic?
Noetic.
Beautiful, beautiful. You're such a way with words, Harrison. But yeah, I just think that we've got a potent combination here of incompetence, and I think it is maliciousness from the Quangos, to be perfectly honest with you. You look at the people that sit on the Migration Advisory Committee. One individual on there works for an organisation that receives millions from the Paul Hamlin Foundation, an avowed open border charity foundation that funds organisations that will keep the borders open, believes migration controls are basically neo-colonialist, deep-seated in racism, and anything that resembles proper kind of order to the border is inherently wrong. So how can someone like that have been elevated to a position where they're able to then say, and just to go back to the Boris Johnson crisis, that because we are ultimately living in a crisis caused by the decisions taken in 2020 to introduce the health and care visa, which has just grown and grown and grown, and the numbers of people arriving under that route are now, I think year-on-year increases from some nationalities are 1,000%.
And I think Connor you have a very good statistic on that, don't you?
I remember Miriam Kate citing in an immigration debate that 2022 to 2023 there were 70,000 care worker visas issued, but only 17,000
vacancies,
gaps in the market filled. So what was the point of the other 50-odd thousand then?
And where are they?
Yeah.
Well, precisely. I mean, that is ultimately the question. The numbers just don't add up, whichever way you cut it. It is really, if you were to look into it, it's the same one for most professions, unfortunately. The idea that someone gets issued a certificate of sponsorship by an organisation, and then that's them here, that's their settled position in this country, is for the birds. Basically, once they get in via whatever route they can get in, then there will be a push for, you know, ultimately the ambition is settlement and settled status, but there's a kind of sense of get in by whatever means and then figure out how to make it work afterwards, and that just isn't the right way to be doing it. It needs to be specific, nuts and bolts. These problems are what need fixing. This individual is purported to be the one that can bring the skill. They can go in there, and then if ultimately we're able to resolve that situation, then, you know, maybe the visa is time limited.
I still sense a real, and I understand this because Boris Johnson was the guy who got Brexit done and all that sort of thing, but I don't sense that people, the kind of people who answer Conservative Home's poll on who's your favourite Tory, and it's always like Penny Mordaunt, but these are good people, but they're a little bit, they're not red-pilled on these kinds of issues. I don't sense that they're sufficiently radicalised on how demographically disastrous Boris Johnson has been. Could you talk through some of the things that he personally did? Whether he can blame the Migration Advisory Committee all he wants. He signed off on it, and he said that he signed a manifesto saying that they would reduce immigration. Overall numbers would come down, I think was the quotation. He passed a whole bevy of measures in 2020, 2021, which in many ways landed us in this whole new situation with respect to immigration, such that it's double what it was under Tony Blair.
So, I mean, Boris had a great opportunity. Boris Johnson had a great opportunity when he came in. Obviously, we left the European Union. It was a chance to completely rewrite the rule book. Again, not to get into where he was getting his advice from, but basically what he introduced was, I think, two key measures. He essentially overhauled the skilled worker route, which dramatically reduced the salary which someone would need if they were to enter the country. I think it was
23 or something.
23,000. Yeah, it used to be high. Could have been a lot higher. It should arguably be, you know, 50, 60,000 if we're being perfectly honest. I mean, I think the general rule is they have to be earning around 38,000 to be an economic contributor.
It also varies from different types of immigrants.
It does.
So if it's an EEA immigrant, an immigrant from the European Union, they start making a net fiscal contribution at a much lower salary threshold, I think it's 28, than is the case with third world immigrants, because third world immigrants are much more likely to bring dependents, much more likely to take up social housing, and so the net fiscal contribution, they need to be earning more to be making that net fiscal contribution.
On that point as well, one of my colleagues calculated this, due to the pandemic inflation caused by their COVID policy, the new upped salary threshold is roughly equivalent to what the prior threshold was worth. So they've essentially wiped out their own...
In real terms?
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at the 38,000 figure of people, you know, breaking even essentially was, I think by today's terms, it would be closer to about 50,000. Yeah. So I think arguably we do need to have a very serious conversation about whether it's, you know, 60, 70,000 as a very minimum in terms of salary.
So that's one thing Johnson did. Sorry, I interrupted. But yeah, and what else did Johnson do?
And the second, he inserted into the very heart of our immigration system the health and care visa, which we have talked about and has been expanded, I believe, twice since he first introduced it, under pressure from the care sector lobbying him, saying there's a crisis, and ultimately, rather than address the care sector crisis, which he did promise he was going to do, and which can be done, let's be clear about that. The care sector companies, you hear stories pretty much every month on a regular basis of them paying out huge dividends to their shareholders. Well, if you're that hard cut that you're having to, you know, bring in cheap overseas labour rather than train British workers, maybe you shouldn't be handing out millions and millions of pounds. So he essentially gave in to their demands, and what we've now got is a health and care visa that has expanded exponentially, so that someone earning about, I think it's £18,000, someone can enter the country, and you know, then there's obviously the accompanying dependents that come with that as well.
Yes, which Johnson was also very lax on. Yes, he was the one who said that they could bring dependents.
He expanded it.
Yes.
It was always kind of been linking around, but he kind of reduced some of the limitations that have been in place.
So before it was just spouses, and now it's grandmothers and
well, now
aunts
dependence is like, what is a dependent?
Yeah.
My next door neighbour I occasionally lend milk to. Does that make them a dependent?
Something else worth noting as well is the standards have clearly slipped in care at a time where there are now more older people to take care of, and there is a longer waiting list due to COVID. There's the recent scandal where lots of Nigerians have come into the NHS with fraudulent qualifications. They're getting their kids to fill out their exams for them. Or the WHO published statistics, I think it was last year, that said 2 in 3 workers in social care have admitted to perpetrating abuse against a patient. That's very alarming. Why should we want to be encouraging that culture in institutions where they're meant to be looking after vulnerable people?
Well, no, we shouldn't. And to be perfectly honest, we'd be better off with robots, with a lot of, and given how primitive they are at the moment, we'd still be better off with them, given the quality of care that some people are being issued. But it's not just the kind of fraudulent approach. I mean, obviously that is rife, and there's no real way to validate the credibility of these qualifications from certain countries. But it's the actual standards that we've set for people coming into this country as well. I think the English language requirements are an ability to say, hello, how are you? Would you like a cup of tea? You can muster that, then pretty much you're deemed there to give someone end-of-life care, or the really kind of tender, intimate things that
which
you do
people
need. Yeah, you're lying there, you're 90, your kids have kind of shoved you in a care home, you're miserable, you've got the BBC for company, so you're even more miserable, and then you've just got these care workers that you're unable to engage any sense of rapport with, and it does break your heart really when you think about it.
Massively, there's no familiarity there. Like, where is the human element here? It's just, oh, here's a vacancy, oh, this qualification will do. It's also very funny as well because, and I don't think all of this was completely wrong on the part of the Remainers, in fact, but they would constantly talk about how this country has much lower standards when it comes to, I mean, it's easy to pick America as chlorine washed chicken, but we can't have free trade with the rest of the world. That's sort of a mad piratical concept, because then we're buying into these massively watered down standards on, making sure that chicken is up to scratch. Why does that not apply to qualifications? Like, what mutual recognition of standards only works with culturally proximate countries, and if you're accepting bevies of care visas from countries which have lower standards on every possible metric, and particularly to do with corruption, likelihood to lie, getting ahead. How corrupt is the police force? That is a good proxy for how likely are these people at scale going to be gaming the system.
I mean, I'd be fascinated to know how many Brits representatives have actually gone over to, say, Nigeria and kind of met and sat down with their examination boards and said, can we see your question papers, please, and just kind of judge where we are at with the kind of quality of care that we are giving. And then obviously, if they are coming here with subpar language requirements, there's less of an ability for them to be inculcated into the British care system and the kind of the standards that we set ourselves, or we should be setting ourselves for our elderly people as well, are arguably vastly different for the kind of care sector that perhaps they've descended from originally.
Yes.
So it's just riddled with problems, and it ultimately does stem from the fact that the government have passed the buck. They've surrendered the idea of actually having a comprehensive care plan. And as a result, our immigration system has shifted wholesale. You were mentioning the fact that EEA migrants are more likely to make a contribution than non-EEA,
lower down the salary threshold.
Lower down the salary threshold.
Yeah.
Our immigration system now is almost exclusively non-EEA. EEAs, we're actually seeing net emigration. So there was a study done in 2018 by Oxford Economics that found that the kind of cohort, are you familiar with it?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
The kind of cohort of non-EEA migrants that arrived that year were actually imposing about I think a £6 to £9 billion cost on the exchequer. So times that by the kind of multitude that we're now seeing, and you realise that we're actually in a pretty dire economic position before you then even get into the soft.
Well, exactly. I think this is something that Connor and I was on the Lotus Eaters a couple of weeks or so ago, and Connor and I had a slight disagreement about this, and I think Carl disagreed with me a bit as well. I was saying that I think that the right I think it was predictable if Brexit, the movement of Brexit. In constitutional terms, I'm a Brexiteer. I think the European Communities Act was a disgrace. I want to repatriate every single sovereign power that was given to Brussels to England. In principle, I think that's a wonder in Britain. I think in principle that's a worthy thing to be doing. But given the personnel that were leading the Brexit campaign, people like Michael Gove, people like Daniel Hannan, people like Boris Johnson, who, in many ways, viewed the European Union as too parochial. They thought it wasn't global enough, and they were talking about global Britain. And they talked about how much they love immigration and how many we want loads of Indian doctors coming, all this sort of thing. I think it should have been predictable to people like us in advance that quite apart from what you thought of Brexit in constitutional terms, politically it was always going to be led by these globalist drones. And so what we've got post-Brexit is more immigration than ever and less European immigration than ever. And that's really significant because European migrants, A, make a net fiscal contribution, B, they're much more likely to return to their country of origin, and C, they have no incentive whatsoever to support anti-white identity politics.
So Brexit did essentially got stolen from us. Brexit was a movement that was very particular to Britain. It was driven by, as you say, a constitutional love of the English settlement, of the English story that had emerged over hundreds, thousands of years. And instead what we got given was a kind of bland, uniform, neoliberal state of this is how we grow our economy. We became essentially a testing lab for these people that had been fermenting their neoliberal ideas, their free trade ideas in and around this area actually. But I mean, you can't tell me that a single person voting to leave the EU in Grimsby was doing so because they wanted to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, or whatever that blooming thing is called. They did it because it was immigration, first and foremost, let's be clear about that. It was an immigration, it was a vote on immigration. And second of all, it was for the kind of constitutional love, the kind of sense of British history being remote and distinct from Europe. None of that factored into play 2017 to 2019. It was purely kind of customs union, free trade. So it was pinched out of us.
The third thing I'd add to that as well is that the people in Sunderland, they represent the constituency that obviously is more socially conservative and wants lower immigration, but also, much like the supporters of Le Pen in France, want the state to recognise the native population as their primary clientele class rather than the foreign diaspora to prove their anti-racist credentials. And so it is true on the side of the Brexit bus that Farage was driving around when he said we're going to invest this much back into the NHS. This was a promise they thought would be fulfilled. Instead, the NHS budget keeps escalating, and that itself manufactures consent for more migrants out of the third world. So I think there's a third element there. If it's not just free marketeer, it's that the state should be actively looking after its own, no matter how we feel about economics. That was a promise made, and instead we've now got net dependence being imported ad infinitum to grow the GDP, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. I think whichever way you cut it, essentially, people just haven't been listened to. And I think, obviously, we heard 2016 to 2019, Brexit's being stolen. There's a massive disconnect between the political class and the British public. But I'd argue that the bigger disconnect is actually now purely on the issue of immigration. The EU is ultimately now it was a constitutional wrangle that got a settlement, whichever way you cut it. Wasn't the best, but we'll take it. But immigration is there's a gaping chasm between where people's actual views are, what they actually want to see happen, and what the MPs are actually giving them. And I think you thought there was damage done to democracy during 2016 to 2019. Just wait until let's see what happens on Thursday. But I think things are going to get really, really tense.
On that, there's another element I think that Boris is responsible for raising the overall mass migration numbers, and it's the various mass asylum schemes that he did with Hong Kong, Afghanistan, start of Ukraine, his role in the war before leaving office. We're seeing now, as of I think it was last Monday, a debate where representatives of all parties turned up to agitate for a pro-Palestinian refugee scheme akin to the Ukrainian one, which would see 200,000 in 2-3 years coming over. And this comes back to the point of we need to make the economic argument, yes, but even if all of these Palestinians were not Hamas supporters and were doctors, lawyers and engineers, I would not necessarily want that there either, because there are going to be cultural incompatibilities. And my fear is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that there's no ministerial appetite demonstrated by the post-Brexit Conservatives, or especially by the Labour Party who have drafted this plan and said they're going to do it when they come in, to, if there is a problem with these people, even if government changes hands, they need to return home. Because there's no limit on those visas either, right? No.
So I mean, on the Palestine front, I'm hoping that it's kind of fanciful spasm of a few left-wing people on the side of the Labour Party. I can't imagine the Conservative Party, even in their infinite wisdom, would go down that route. Keir Starmer is perhaps a different kettle of fish. I think the risk that we do face for the next 40, 50 years, ultimately, well, until the end of the century, and then maybe even beyond, is we are now living in an age of mass migration. And it's not just the pull factors like the easygoing migration system that we've adopted here. It is the kind of, more domestic, specific to certain areas around the world that are driving these people to descend en masse to the Western world, which I guess is inevitable when you look at the kind of relative wealth that we have compared to them. But we can't be encouraging it. Humanitarian schemes have to be specific and precise. They can't be open door to anyone that happens to be experiencing any tiny plight in their area of the world. There has to be a sense of, if we are to engage in the humanitarian work with the Palestinians, it needs to be ultimately a work of, well, let's try and resettle them somewhere that's more culturally compatible in the Middle East, because it's doing a disservice to them, really, to have to bring them. I mean, maybe not. I guess they'd probably be inclined to take a ticket over here.
Well, it's interesting you say that though, Rob, because I think I've noticed a slight cleavage between the let's say the more tribalistic minority Muslim MPs in the Labour Party and the sort of the white MPs who have a guilty conscience about Palestine but aren't as tribally invested in it, let's say. One example of an exception here would be George Galloway, because he's much more trying to court the Muslim vote rather than trying to court the bleeding heart liberal vote. A lot of Muslims living in Britain don't want Palestinians to be coming here, and it's not because they don't want to live alongside them, although maybe that's true as well. I mean, Jordanians and Egyptians don't particularly want to live alongside them, so I don't see why we should. But that aside, a lot of them think that it is doing too much of a favour to Israel to take this problem off their hands, and that it's a kind of form of ethnic cleansing in the name of humanitarianism, is what they will say. So I think there's a bit of a divide. In fact, I've noticed a bit of a divide between the people who are really gung-ho on Palestine, usually for religious or tribal or ethnic reasons, and the people who don't know the area as well, but are sort of bleeding heart white liberals in the Labour Party who think, oh gosh, we're hemorrhaging the Muslim vote, maybe this will be a nice way of trying to recover some of that support.
That's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about it that way. That's yeah, that's something to think about. I think ultimately it will be the white guilt, the kind of need to do well, the kind of global liberal bleeding heart agenda that is going to set our migration policy for the next 30 years. Well, unless you Zoomers pull your act together and start grabbing the reins of power pretty darn quick, we're in for a bit of difficulty. I think that there's such a tendency to view the world's problems as our problems, to think that, well, we're Britain, we've got a kind of global leadership role, soft power role. We've got a duty to step in any escapade that takes place across the map. And I just think there needs to be a cold, hard dose of reality that just says, no, this is what we want to see happen. Humanitarian schemes, you could maybe understand with the Hong Kong on the BNO aspect of things. Ukraine, I think they would have been better off being settled closer to where they're from.
Which many of them have been.
Many of them have been.
I think Hungary and Poland have borne the brunt.
But with those two groups, to steal a line from Konstantin Kisin, who is himself not a particularly far right man, there are no Hong Kongese or Ukrainian grooming gangs. So we should reserve the right to differentiate between the stories that peoples tell themselves. And I think the Palestinians, in their story, we're the villain. So why would we want to bring them here?
Well, precisely. And I guess, obviously they're not of the culture of Britain, but they have the similar values, the similar recognition from Hong Kong, the kind of democracy, and they'd be easier to kind of to assimilate, I'd argue, than someone that comes from a completely alien perspective that doesn't even recognise fundamental values that we've currently built our country on.
And which is likely to despise our countries and the West's general foreign policy. I mean, bear in mind, it's one thing to lend full diplomatic and moral support to Israel, which most Western countries are doing, particularly in the aftermath of the heinous crimes committed on the 7th of October. Why then would you take in the people who are most pissed off about what's been going on in that region for the last 70 years? They're not exactly going to reward us for showing full diplomatic and moral support to Israel. They're not going to like that about us. These people are going to be have a direct incentive upon contact with British soil to be furiously anti-British.
But I mean, I guess the question is with the Palestine issue, and what these 50 MPs need to grapple with is, would Palestinians really be inclined to actually leave that area? They're still, distraught about the creation of Israel, that they argue dispossessed them from their land. So would they really see leaving it as a viable option either? To be perfectly honest, I don't think there's not enough geopolitical thought as to what is actually motivating those people in that area, what actually inspires Palestinians, what they actually want to see happen. And I think it is just a kind of, what can we offer you? We can offer you, residency. Come on over. That's pretty much the only tool we seem to have at our disposal at the moment.
We'll finish on this, Rob. I was going to ask, one thing I've been troubled about recently, I think Neil O'Brien's written about this, Connor's covered this, quite a bit. The fact that we're going to be getting over the next few years worse and worse. I mean, the data is already pretty sketchy on immigration. We're going to be getting the world of data is going to be even more impoverished when it comes to immigration, and therefore it will make it harder for people like us to make our arguments on a sort of day-to-day policy basis. Is this part of the reason why you set up the Centre for Migration Control? Because you put out a good amount of data, and what are the main things they're trying to take away at the ONS and at these other places?
So it's less what they're trying to take away, and it's more what have they just neglected to collect since things ever started, or you know, what have they neglected to collate?
Yes.
And I think that comes from a tendency to have not thought these things worthy of monitoring. I don't think people ever thought that mass migration would lead to a spike in crime, so we don't have the statistics on, you know, the nationalities broken down. I don't think they thought that people would, you know, maybe be interested in seeing how many deportation orders they've issued against foreign nationals, so they don't have that data available. I think probably the pressure from the kind of Neil O'Briens, who are really good on hammering home the kind of FOI front, will mean that they'll have to keep some avenues open. But we are dealing with diminishing resources here, and you're right. Part of the reason I kind of thought that the Centre for Migration Control needed to be set up was that there is still numbers out there. There are still things with which you can try and paint somewhat of a picture. It might be foggy, it might not be perfect, but it's still something. It's still something, because we have spent the last 10 years really flying blind in this debate. People have not been able to get a true sense of the scale of the problem. They've just been having to rely on their eyes and ears, which are a lot of the time, you know, more accurate than anything they'll hear in a government press release. But I still think that there is a need to kind of paint people a bit more of a picture, and I hope what we do is somewhat helpful.
Well, I think you're doing really, really sterling work, and thank you for sharing some of those insights with us today. But before we sign off, where can people follow Centre for Migration Control, follow some of your work?
Brilliant. Yeah, if you could follow us on at Centre Migration Control. No, it's not that, sorry. It's at Migration Control, CTRL. I don't do the social media. And then check out our website, www.centreformigrationcontrol.com. We should have a few reports coming out in the next couple of weeks that hopefully will help shape the debate going forward after these numbers come out.
Well, as I say, Rob, it's a real privilege. Connor, thank you so much for co-presenting. You've been watching Deprogrammed. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you wish to do so, and we shall see you on the next one.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.